content of this channel is for mature audiences. Parental discretion is advised. You're tuned in to the Green Gorilla channel. Please make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell notification button. And please, feel free to share the video. Thank you. What's cracking, y'all, man? I'm GG, man. You tuned in to the Green Gorilla channel. It is the place where black men can express themselves freely, straight up with no chases, man. I know I ain't got no music going on right now. And some reason, man, I got to get this damn Stream Deck thing going right, man. It's giving me some issues right now. Some reason. Apologize for the the interruption, man. Stream Deck, it ain't working like it's supposed to. It's not activating media like it should. But, it is what it is, bro. I'm gonna work on that shit this afternoon, man. But I just wanted to come in right now and read another section of this text, the Dark Ghetto. So let me just get right to it. I would go into the intro and do all the name dropping and all that. I appreciate all the people who subscribe to the channel. I just did this impromptu. I got some other things I want to attend to this afternoon. So I'm doing this now so I can get it over with so I can move on with the other portions of my day, okay? So having said that, man, let me go right to what it is I'm trying to do. I'm going to get right to it. Ain't nothing to it but to do it. For those that dance, clap your hands to it. All right, so of course, as you know, I've been reading this text. It's entitled Dark Ghettos, Injustice, Dissent, and Reform. And it's written by Tommy Shelby. Today, what I'm going to do is finish the chapter that I started. And then before I move on to the next section of the book, I'll go over everything that has been covered thus far as if we were doing some sort of test review, okay? So we can be up to speed with what's taking place in the next chapter. So there's no gaps, no lacunas, no misunderstandings, no abrupt breaks, okay? So having said all that, before I get started, I want to do one thing. So hold on for 1 second, hold on. All right, I appreciate your patience with me, man. So, at any rate, man, I want to finish this chapter. So let me get into it. Let me just make sure I'm doing this right, man. The chapter is entitled Culture, okay? And the section that I'm going to read is Moral Paternalism and Compromises with Injustice, okay? And so when I come back the next time, I'll recap all of this because this is the end of the first section of the book, okay? So anyway, the author, his name is Tommy Shelby. He's a philosopher from Harvard. This is what he says, okay, about moral paternalism, okay? Recognizing the practical limits of moral outreach, moral reformers may give up on this strategy or supplement it with a more aggressive measure or measures. They may advocate cultural rehabilitation through a system of rewards and sanctions. So if moral outreach is not enough, people who want to engage in moral reform in the black community may give up on it and then try to institute what he would say is cultural rehabilitation, okay? He says this strategy would not depend on the willing cooperation of the intended beneficiaries. So whether they like it or not, whether they accept it or not, we're going to do this anyway. We're going to reshape people's culture without their approval, okay? Whether they like it or not, okay? The moral reformers would attempt to arrange society's incentive structure to produce a deep cultural transformation in their subjects. Their subjects, however, may not fully realize what the benefactors are attempting to accomplish, or may not willingly go along, or may not desire the change in themselves that the reformers want to effect. In this approach, moral reformers work on, not with, the ghetto poor. Their methods are intended to be effective despite resistance from the black urban poor. Call this mode of moral reform moral paternalism. Okay? I can already see where this is going. Like, you gonna tell me what the fuck I'm supposed to be doing? Like, I had a discussion about this yesterday briefly, but I mean, the whole point is, how is it that you're going to impact the change on a group of people and force them into a point of view or to adopt virtue or concepts or, you know, ethos, you know, an ethos of virtue that you want, despite what it is that they want. Okay? Anyway, many liberals find the idea of moral paternalism distasteful. No shit. And in a more just world, they would eschew it. However, faced with current political realities, and in light of their abiding concern to help the poor and disadvantaged, some may be tempted to advocate moral paternalism. For example, sympathetic liberals could argue that they do not urge moral reform because they believe the criticisms typically leveled at the ghetto poor are entirely fair or generally spring from non-racist motives. Okay? Let me read that paragraph again because it's not written in a way that's smooth. So, for example, sympathetic liberals could argue that they do not urge moral reform because they believe criticisms typically leveled at the ghetto poor are entirely fair or generally spring from non-racist motives. They might simply insist that cultural traits that seem to confirm black stereotypes make it harder to generate among the general public the goodwill that is needed to change the structural conditions that create and perpetuate ghettos. So they want to purge the cultural traits that seem to confirm black stereotypes, which make it harder for people in the general public to bestow goodwill upon persons, such that the attendant structural changes that ought to happen in the United States do. Okay? These liberals may lament the fact that too many Americans regard the poor as undeserving, and that on this ground, these citizens are unwilling to invest the necessary public resources to eliminate urban poverty. However, without the support of at least some of these people, liberal structural reform is not feasible, and so the black poor would continue to suffer needlessly. In response to this political reality, some liberals may be prepared to attach stiff penalties or even minor legal infractions to littering, loitering, black market activity, and such, to impose work requirements on welfare recipients with young children, to aggressively monitor and supervise the behavior of ghetto denizens, and so on. Because without successful moral reform of the black urban poor, structural reform efforts won't be efficacious. Won't be any point to it. Okay. So the author says, I have serious doubts. I have serious doubts about the soundness of the social theoretic assumptions behind any such strategy. Now, this is the author's opinion, okay? So let me highlight that. In particular, about whether reducing stereotypical behavior and attitudes will garner the desired public will. I said something similar yesterday, okay? Even if you reduce stereotypical behavior and attitudes, are you going to actually get the goodwill? I don't know. But leaving this aside, this liberal pragmatism threatens the self-respect of the ghetto poor. If, as some cultural analysts maintain, the suboptimal cultural traits of the ghetto poor are a response to systemic injustice, then it is not reasonable to expect the urban poor to submit to moral reform to prove their worthiness for government interventions to improve structural conditions. So this is a big claim here. So if, and I'm going to accept that. I don't want to get the conditional in there. I mean, what this qualification thing here and there. If the suboptimal traits of the ghetto poor are a response to systemic injustice, then it is not reasonable to expect the urban poor to submit to moral reform to prove their worthiness for government interventions to improve structural conditions. Okay? Capitulating to the widely held and insulting view that they do not deserve better life chances is fundamentally at odds with the ghetto poor maintaining their self-respect. So yeah, any group of people who say, well, you know, we're not worthy of better conditions, we're not worthy of conditions that are better than ghetto conditions because we wear our pants sagging, or, you know, we smoke marijuana, or we listen to loud ass trap music, or we don't, you know, score high on the SAT or the ACT. It's like, what the fuck does that have to do with structural conditions that are just and fair? One could argue not very much, but, you know, I digress. Anyway, the author says, fair treatment and a just basic structure are things they are entitled to in virtue of their status as moral equals and rational agents, and cannot be justly withheld on account of their alleged suboptimal identities or values. Shout out to Eclectic Agitator. Thank you for the donation there, sir. And also thank you for the donation on the Cash App from Anubis. Appreciate that. Appreciate that. So I got my head kind of buried in this document, so I apologize if I don't acknowledge some of the things that you're saying in the chat. But anyway, this is important as well. That whole section is important. So, I mean, in essence, what he's saying here is, what do you mean we don't deserve better conditions? If we know that the ghetto conditions were created out of injustice in and of itself, then one could argue that, and the government worked actively to create the conditions that exist there, then the government ought to, pertaining to, you know, justice, do what they ought to do in order to redress the injustice of the conditions they created in the first place. I mean, and to try to force, you know, people who live in the ghetto to basically say, well, they don't deserve better conditions. Well, that's an attack on their self-respect. That's what the author's saying, okay? And then he also goes on to say that fair treatment and a just basic structure are things that everyone in society is entitled to. You don't parse out justice related to desert. Justice and desert are two different things, two different concepts altogether. Shout out to Hakeem, who just hit me up on a joint. Appreciate that. So yeah, it doesn't matter, you know, like you don't deserve, justice is not something that's distributed, predicated upon what somebody deserves. Now, when you start talking about desert, and that's the noun form of the verb, you know, to deserve, or, you know, or deserve. When you start talking about desert, you're talking about things that people have done and have mixed their effort and energy into such that they deserve, like, you know, what they receive based on that effort. But justice is an entirely different matter altogether. You don't have to work or deserve or put effort into be treating justly. Okay? The ghetto poor have legitimate justice claims against their government that are not negated by what they do in response to that government's historical and ongoing failure to honor these claims. As equal citizens taking part in a system of social cooperation, each acquires legitimate claims on fellow participants as defined by just rules of political association. And we should not regard what a citizen is entitled to by justice as proportional to, nor dependent upon, the quality of his or her moral character. Okay? Now, there are people who are going to disagree with this. They're going to say, well, you know, if you get treated justly, it's something that you ought to deserve. But one could argue, I mean, you know, if you want to go into the depths, the bowels and the entrails of the Western philosophical and political tradition, I mean, you know, the whole, and the moral and ethical tradition and religious tradition, I mean, the point is that you have innate dignity merely for existing. At least that's what's professed, because we know that they act differently. But I mean, the whole point is, because they treat different people differently, okay? But the whole argument that they make is that just by existing, there's dignity bestowed upon you. If that's the case, there's nothing that you have to do in order to demonstrate that you be treated justly. Now, if somebody's breaking the law, or, you know, somebody hurts or harms somebody else, then we can talk about retributive justice and justice as it pertains to punishment, but that's a whole different subject matter altogether than distributive justice in and of itself, okay? So anyway, he says, I may seem to have left myself open to the following rejoinder. Sometimes advancing the broader cause of justice means compromising with particular injustices. Sacrifices of self-respect are unpleasant, even painful for those who must make them, but they are sometimes necessary in the short term to make progress in the long run. Threatening the self-respect of the current generation of the ghetto poor may simply be the price of the social reform needed to ensure the future generations do not grow up in ghetto conditions. He says, I don't deny that sacrifices of self-respect can be justified. It may be perfectly reasonable for one to endure indignities, to protect the vulnerable, to preserve one's life, or even to advance the cause of justice. What I'm opposing is the idea that others are permitted to decide when you should make such sacrifices. That's a biggie right there. I would give a bomb to it, but my shit is not working right now. I get at a bomb. I believe he's right there. It's one thing to ask or even implore the ghetto poor to sacrifice some self-respect to achieve needed social reforms, to ask him, please, be self-effacing for the sake of future generations. Please give up some of your dignity, sacrifice some of your self-respect for a future gain. And then they say, okay, well, yes, we'll do so. It's another thing to force somebody to, you know, to do it. So anyway, it says it's quite another to demand that they make these sacrifices on pain of penalty or to take measures that effectively force them to accommodate themselves to injustice. Moral paternalism robs the ghetto poor of a choice that should be theirs alone. That's important. Namely, whether the improved prospects for ending or ameliorating ghetto poverty are worth the loss of moral pride they would incur by conceding the offensive view that they have not shown themselves to be deserving of better treatment. Whether such sacrifices of self-respect are, all things considered, worth it, should be left to those who bear the heaviest burdens. He again makes this argument, right? If there's going to be any sacrifice of self-respect, any ledger related to having to take on duty in order to bring about justice or something of that nature, he's going to say, you know, the people who bear the heaviest burdens should be the ones who make such choices and decisions. It shouldn't be left up to technocrats or bureaucrats who think that they know what's best. Should be left up to the people who are going to be most heavily impacted by the strategy or the policy. Okay? So I'm going to highlight that as well. Using one generation of the ghetto poor as unwilling instruments to bring about justice for the next generation is also wrong. We should not treat the ghetto poor as if they did not have purposes, including moral aims of their own, as if they were mere things to be turned to purposes, however noble, that we see as fit. As moral agents who should be regarded as equals, but most of I can guarantee you, man, there's black guys in the manosphere who do not see people who live in the ghetto as equals and people who are bestowed with moral dignity. Not to say that all of the guys, who are in the manosphere who are conservative think this way, but I've heard language that, it's egregious. I'm just being honest. I've heard language that, quite frankly, it's a tad bit offensive, if not fantastic. But anyway, and that's not an allusion to Mr. Fantastic at all. That's just me using the English language. So anyway, he says, as moral agents who should be regarded as equals, they ought to be sought out as willing participants in efforts to bring about just social conditions. In addition, their basic interest in equal liberty and public respect should not be treated as tradable for welfare gains for others, not even when the beneficiaries would be their descendants, as this would represent a fundamental compromise in their standing as equal citizens with autonomy. He goes on to say, some liberal proponents of moral paternalism might advocate such measures in ghettos, not as a pragmatic political strategy in a conservative era, but based on a sincere belief that certain cultural traits prevalent in ghettos damage the well-being of the ghetto poor, making their already awful situation worse. It might be held, for example, that the ghetto poor do not fully appreciate the devastating effect of these cultural traits on their lives. Moral paternalism then could be viewed as a compassionate response to suboptimal cultural divergence, even if some among the ghetto poor fail to see how such an intervention is in their best interest. That's a technocratic, or epistemological problem. We know better. A besser wissen problem, right? Anyway, the poor in ghettos nonetheless have reason to find this stance condescending and offensive. Such paternalistic attitudes are fundamentally incompatible with the liberal value of respect for persons. I told you. The ghetto poor are free persons. Let me just say that. Look, this should be like non-controversial. But for some reason, it doesn't seem like, like this. Fucking dogs in this backyard, man, barking like a. Hold on, man. I gotta calm them down, man. Tell them shut the fuck up. Hold on. All that goddamn noise. I apologize for that, man. These dogs, man, back there acting a damn fool. All right. So anyway, don't want to add a comment to that, but it should be understood that ghetto people, ghetto poor, or the ghetto poor, they are free persons. For some reason, that gets lost on people. And so rightly expect to be accorded the respect due all who have this status. Showing that respect means, among other things, regarding persons as capable of revising their fundamental aims in response to good reasons, and as capable of taking responsibility for their basic ambitions in life. Apart from their interest in meeting their material needs, persons have a fundamental interest in being treated with this kind of respect. Though the liberal aspiration to meet these other needs is laudable, the goal is not a sufficient reason to override their fellow citizens' claim to be treated as free and equal. Well, we're going to do this for you. We're going to make you, we're going to turn you into a better person. In addition, paternalism, as is well known, is hard to justify under just background conditions. Paternalism toward a segment of society acknowledged to be victims of social injustice is all the more suspect. A high burden of proof must be met to even consider such problematic measures. Shout out to Joe's, man. Appreciate that. Shout out to Joe's. So, and I'm sorry, man, I had to go back there and check on these dogs, man. These dogs, I had to check on them, so I apologize for that. There was a lot of noise being made by them. I had to calm them down. So the next section is called Dignity, Injustice, and the State. He says, there is, however, a third conception of self-respect, which we might call dignity. I've used the word dignity, but now he's defining it in a different kind of way. So, eventually I'm going to go over all of this before I start on the next chapter. Because the next chapter, he starts talking about family life, reproduction, who should and who shouldn't reproduce, single families, and all of this kind of shit. So he goes into all of that. But these are his background conditions for having a discussion about integration and moral reform and cultural rehabilitation. This is what, because people talk about this shit in the black manosphere all the time, but not in a systematic or a philosophical way. They just don't. So anyway, there is, however, a third conception of self-respect, which we might call dignity. Like self-esteem and self-respect, dignity has two components. The belief that no matter one's circumstances, one should do whatever is within one's power to secure one's basic physical and psychological well-being, including one's future well-being, and the will to act on this belief. Okay, so that's what dignity is. Dignity has two components. Let me make sure I get this because I'm going to come back and outline it. So it has two components. The belief that no matter your circumstances, and if you're rich, you're poor, whatever, you should do whatever is within your power to make sure that your physical and psychological well-being is secured, including your future well-being, and the will to act on this belief. Why is maintaining our dignity a worthwhile end? He says we are by nature self-conscious, rational animals, capable of assessing the reasons in favor of and against various courses of action, and capable of acting for good reasons and not simply from impulse, habit, or appetite. So we're rational animals who have the capacity to act upon maxims that we develop for ourselves, principles of action that we make for ourselves. We don't just have to act based upon habit, impulse, or appetite. In fact, our status as objects of moral concern and respect rests partly on our capacity for rational deliberation and free action, and not merely on our capacity to experience pleasure and pain. Now, I mean, you see people who are liberals. This is like a sneak diss against utilitarianism, but I'm not going to even get into why that is. But it is therefore imperative that we safeguard our rational nature, and it's very Kantian as well, this is. Anyway, it is therefore imperative that we safeguard our rational nature, not permitting our capacity for rationality to drop below a reasonable level. We can do this only if our basic welfare, healthy and normal functioning, is not severely compromised. Persons with dignity, concerned to show respect for their rational agency, remain resilient in the face of adversity, not allowing hardships, even unjust ones, to make them feel so defeated that they effectively give up on life. Wallowing in a sense of helplessness, willfully engaging in self-destructive behavior, and no longer caring about whether or how one survives, demonstrate that one does not value one's rational agency sufficiently. Consider, for example, the person who has succumbed to a life organized, let me start this sentence again. Consider, for example, the person who succumbed to a life organized around substance abuse due to an overwhelming sense of hopelessness and worthlessness brought on by living under oppressive conditions. When people sink to this level of degradation, as some living in ghettos arguably have, it is obvious that they need assistance from others, whether they recognize this or not. Their capacity for rationality has been so damaged that they don't even recognize the loss of dignity they have undergone, or, despite apprehending this terrible loss, may be incapable of regaining it on their own. Some liberals might argue that moral paternalism, while unjustified under ordinary circumstances, including some unjust conditions, is permissible in such extreme cases. So let's suppose that some among the ghetto poor, unbeknownst to themselves, do need help freeing themselves from a culture of defeatism and debasement that endangers their dignity, and that information, rational persuasion, and voluntary programs would be insufficient to the task. It would still be morally problematic for a person or an organization, qua representative of the state, to presume to be the appropriate agent to provide this unrequested help, at least when this assistance takes the form of moral paternalism. So he's saying, even if there's a crackhead that's out there, it's still morally problematic for a person or organization, especially a government representative or a government official, to presume to be the appropriate agent to provide this unrequested help, especially if it takes the form of moral paternalism. The freedom of the ghetto poor is already constrained by unjust conditions, which the state has failed to rectify. It would add insult to injury for the state to further constrain their freedom with the view to preventing them from making themselves worse off. In short, given its failure to secure a just basic structure, the state lacks the moral standing to act as an agent of moral reform. There it is in a nutshell right there. That's the argument right there. Given its failure to secure a just basic structure, the state lacks the moral authority and standing to act as an agent of moral reform. The state could perhaps earn this standing, but only after it had made substantive and sustained efforts to ensure a just social structure, thus establishing its legitimacy and goodwill in the eyes of those it seeks to help. In the meantime, non-governmental organizations and private individuals must fill the gap, perhaps using public funds, but even then with limited government intrusion. So I mean, like, I don't know, like, what this means here. I gotta to probe deeper into that. I don't know if I accept that or not. NGOs and individuals now must fill the gap. Like, I mean, if it's the case that a government cannot impose or infringe upon a person's self-respect, self-esteem, and dignity, I don't see what's to prevent the same from, being levied, or the same argument being imposed upon NGOs and private individuals. Like, it fucks me up, man, for people who, I'm not saying he's saying this, but it fucks me up for people to say, well, I don't want the government to impose or infringe upon my liberty, but a corporation, a non-governmental organization, or, private individuals can. To me, that's inconsistent. He says we should be alert, though, to the possibility that what appears to be a tragic loss of dignity might, in fact, be an affirmation of self-respect. And I guess he's saying this about the ghetto poor. So let me highlight that. Though their actions may suggest diminished dignity, those with suboptimal characteristics might not have given up on life and might not be suffering from weakness of will. Rather, they have reasons to view their outlook as a realistic posture in light of their government's wrongful actions. From malign neglect to vicious assaults and their fellow citizens' self-serving contempt. They can permissibly choose to accept the risks of their cultural attitudes and practices rather than attempt to live in accordance with mainstream values while lacking the resources and opportunities they are due. And they can do this with a justified sense of moral pride. Perhaps what they most need and desire then is not unsolicited state-sponsored help, but simply justice. That's important. One way to respect this reasonable stance would be to honor the prerogative of the ghetto poor to decide when their defiant behavior and suboptimal cultural traits are worth the personal cost and risk. So the next section is moral reform and other duties. And duties to others. Moral reform and duties to others. The form of liberal egalitarianism defended here does not rely on the dubious idea that the oppressed must never be criticized for how they respond to injustice. So there you go. So for those who say they're just making excuses, he's making excuses. He's like, no, that's not it. I'm not saying we should never say shit about the poor or the ghetto poor. Not all criticisms of the unjustly disadvantaged are problematic victim blaming. So he's saying, okay, you can go at, the ghetto poor here and there, okay? Moral criticism of the ghetto poor is sometimes warranted despite the unjust conditions that circumscribe their lives. Though not everyone has the standing to make such criticisms. That's a qualification there. I'm not going to look at the footnote right now. Those mired in ghetto poverty, just like many among the non-poor, sometimes have ambitions that are not in fact worthwhile, but morally base and wrong. They sometimes choose immoral means to achieve their legitimate goals. And they sometimes give undue weight in deliberation to some of their group affiliations. So, for example, it is morally objectionable that some use deadly violence. So here you go. So you can't say he's making excuses. It is morally objectionable that some use deadly violence to secure luxury goods and social status. That some sexually degrade and assault others. That some allow gang loyalty to trump what should be overriding moral considerations like respecting the rights of others and assisting the weak and vulnerable. So there it goes. So he's not saying I endorse or support, like many of you guys You just assume because people are talking about structural conditions of injustice that this is nothing more than a sanction for gang activity or sexual or, like physical assault or using violence in order to, take things away from people so that you can live a life of luxurious material consumption. So he says that these bases of self-esteem are not worthy of respect. And sometimes they are appropriately condemned, at least by those who have not been complicit in creating or perpetuating these practices. The ghetto poor, like the rest of us, have moral duties to others that are not voided because of unjust social conditions. So there you have it. This is not a license to do illicit or illegal shit. So he says the ghetto poor, like the rest of us, have moral duties to others that are not voided because of unjust social conditions. We should refrain from violent aggression against others and should not abuse, endanger, abandon, or neglect the children in our care. For instance, there should be legal proscriptions, which means, like things that we don't sanction, things that we say you should not do. There should be legal proscriptions against these wrongful actions, even when these acts are perpetrated by the unjustly disadvantaged. Accordingly, it will sometimes be permissible and even morally required for the state to use coercive means to ensure that these duties are fulfilled and their corresponding rights protected. He says, see chapter 8. I'm not going to go there just yet. Thus, one legitimate rationale for intervening in the lives of the ghetto poor is to protect innocent persons, including children, from legally proscribed, harmful, immoral conduct. So there we go. It is a requirement of social justice that the state play this role in the lives of those within its territorial jurisdiction. A state that fails to do so treats those under its rule unjustly, just as it does when it fails to secure a fair distribution of the benefits and burdens of socio-economic cooperation. When this protective function goes unfulfilled under unjust social conditions, like those that exist in ghetto neighborhoods, the state compounds the burdens on the oppressed and undermines its own legitimacy in their eyes. This raises the difficult question of whether moral reform of criminal offenders can be justified on the grounds that it is needed to protect third parties from harmful wrongdoing. So, for example, the cultural rehabilitation of violent criminal offenders might be regarded as a crime control measure, as an effort to reduce recidivism. More controversially, moral reform could be directed at parents who have abused or neglected their children. This abuse and neglect might be attributed to suboptimal parenting styles acquired through intergenerational or peer influence. Perhaps moral reform would be justified in these cases. Okay. But then he goes on to say, this isn't obvious though. When the criminal justice system or children's protective services do intervene to protect the rights of persons against the wrongful actions of others, moral reform may not be needed, advisable, or even permissible. Behavior modification without cultural rehabilitation, for example, through well-constructed and fair punitive measures, may be all that is called for and justifiable. So, one thing, behavior modification is different from cultural rehabilitation. So, I'm not going to spell that out right now, but that's just a distinction he's making. He says, I return to some of these questions in chapter 7 and 8, where I discuss crime and punishment. But for now, my concern is with how cultural patterns in ghettos may hold back the socio-economic advance of some in their grip, and whether moral reform is a legitimate anti-poverty strategy. I'm not addressing whether moral reform is an appropriate response to criminal deviance or parental malfeasance. State interventions aimed at ensuring that people fulfill their moral responsibilities to others have a different normative status from interventions aimed at ensuring that people do not harm their own interests. So in other words, I mean, that's an important distinction right there. So I'm gonna highlight that. It's one thing, for the state to intervene when you might cause harm to somebody else. It's another thing quite altogether to say that, okay, well, look, we're going to intervene in order to do something that we feel is in your best interest. So it's a different subject matter altogether. It is the latter rationale for moral reform that is the subject here. And my objection is to moral reform whose objective is helping the Black urban poor escape poverty. Okay? So he's making that distinction, okay? 3 egalitarian responses. And hopefully this is getting to the end. I think 117 is if I'm not mistaken, 117 is the end of this journey. 116, we closer than close. Closer than close. Three egalitarian responses. Many egalitarians adamantly oppose state-sponsored moral reform, especially in the context of societal injustice. They believe the government should not be in the business of structuring the intimate lives or moral consciousness of embattled citizens, but rather should focus its efforts on protecting basic liberties, ensuring a fair distribution of resources, meeting vital needs, and maintaining a just opportunity structure. There are 2 important egalitarian responses to cultural divergence, to the cultural divergence thesis that deny the validity of the thesis itself. Okay, so I'm gonna highlight that. The first insists that the cultural lives of the ghetto poor do not actually diverge from the mainstream, if by that one means the average American. I say this quite often myself, but I don't know if it's... These egalitarians point out that the attitudes and practices associated with the ghetto poor, laziness, hedonism, devaluation of academic achievement, materialism, promiscuity, rudeness, substance abuse, lack of respect for authority, non-marital reproduction, irresponsible parenting, and violence are also pervasive among the affluent and the vaunted middle class. The cultural patterns found in the ghetto are not specific to it, but are part of a much broader cultural current within the United States. The difference they maintain is that the poor have far fewer resources than their more advantaged fellow citizens. This means that they are much less able to bear the costs of this lifestyle. Thus, some of the burdens of the ghetto poor's choices, higher taxes, urban blight, school disruption, and street crime, are shifted onto those with greater means. Many among the affluent resent this fact and therefore adopt punitive, authoritarian, or paternalistic responses to the disadvantaged living in the deteriorated urban core. But this resentment is unjustified, for the distribution of the benefits and burdens of social cooperation in the United States is profoundly unfair. And so the responsibility for these negative externalities cannot be solely placed on the ghetto poor. Moreover, targeting the ghetto poor for moral reform is hypocritical, as many so-called mainstream Americans possess the same moral traits they decry. I agree with that. I agree with that. Hold on one second. One second. Sorry about that. But then he goes on to say, in other words, in essence, like, look, the urban poor's or the ghetto poor's habits are like just nothing more than reflections of the mainstream culture anyway. It's just that their poverty exacerbates their ability or their capacity to bear on, to kind of like bear these kind of traits in a way that, is indiscernible or functional. I think that's the better way of putting it. The second egalitarian response acknowledges that cultural patterns in ghettos do diverge from the mainstream, but insists that this divergence is not suboptimal. According to this view, so that's the second egalitarian response, say, yeah, okay, there are divergences, but it's not necessarily suboptimal. According to this view, group cultures are adaptive, collective responses to the structural environment. The ghetto poor are simply responding rationally to the constraints of high ghetto walls, though perhaps they do not conceive of their values and practices in such terms, with the result being not a suboptimal culture, but a culture that fits the external environment. This culture would change, perhaps swiftly, with improved material circumstances and greater protection of civil rights, as the formerly poor would rationally adapt to their better conditions. Thus, if we tear down these walls, that is, make the basic structure more just, we would thereby effect a positive change in the culture of ghettos without having to resort to moral reform. It says these two positions are important rivals to liberal moral reform. Though I will not assess them here, I mention them for two reasons. Because they are alternatives worthy of serious consideration, and because I want to distinguish them from the one I defend. I close this chapter then by sketching a different kind of egalitarian response to the cultural configurations found in ghetto neighborhoods. A liberal egalitarian response that does not depend on rejecting the suboptimal cultural divergence hypothesis. Okay, so this is what he wants to maintain, the suboptimal cultural divergence hypothesis. I probably would go in the direction of objection one, but let's see what he has to say. Self-esteem, self-respect, and collective resistance. Recall the relative normative commitments of liberal egalitarianism. To be reasonably just, a society must take effective measures to defeat racism in all its forms, ideological, institutional, and structural. Ensure that wrongful discrimination does not diminish persons' life chances. Establish and maintain the conditions for fair equality of opportunity, eliminating as far as possible the effects of class origins on individuals' relative life prospects and labor market competitiveness, and provide a guaranteed minimum income and adequate social services so that no one is forced to live in degrading forms of poverty. I've also argued, and will provide further support in chapters to come, that as a factual matter, these principles of justice are not currently realized in the United States. So I just want to, I'm gonna have to outline all that. If these normative premises and the factual claim are correct, it almost certainly will take a social movement to realize liberal egalitarian ideals for there is currently strong resistance to such reform. If we want to build and sustain such a movement, it is not enough to act on behalf of the unjustly disadvantaged. We should also enlist and welcome their active involvement, including the participation of the ghetto poor. So in other words, you have to get them involved. I mean, this is like it's like participative democracy in a sense. You know, like those who are impacted by decisions ought to have some say in the deliberation about the decision. Okay. Anyway, the effort to garner and maintain the cooperation of the ghetto poor faces a number of challenges, however. So how do you get the cooperation and maintain it from the ghetto poor? One challenge is brought into focus by the cultural divergence thesis. The thesis holds that stigma, blight, segregation, fragile families, street crime, lack of opportunity, and material deprivation have shaped the ambitions, values, practices, and identities of many ghetto denizens. In particular, an attitude prevalent in ghettos, though not exclusive to them, is political cynicism, a belief that the social system is deeply corrupt and that therefore meaningful structural change cannot be achieved through mainstream channels. I want to highlight that. Such a stance naturally leads to low levels of political participation in electoral politics and political organizations, such as political parties and labor organizations. This is hardly surprising, because a familiar response to long-term, second-class citizenship is an absence of civic engagement and an acceptance of unjust conditions as inevitable. If, as the cultural divergence thesis maintains, such attitudes encourage the development of corresponding social identities and forms of group-based self-esteem, then it may be necessary for some cultural configurations of the ghetto poor to change after all. Without this change, the politically alienated among the ghetto poor cannot be regarded as suitable allies in a collective effort to bring about just social conditions, at least not through ordinary democratic means. The difficulty is how to effect this cultural change without undermining the self-esteem, attacking the self-respect, or calling into question the dignity of those who have been most burdened by the social injustices that call for rectification. That just seems like a good point. Are there considerations in favor of a change in their cultural ways that it would be reasonable for the ghetto poor to accept? Considerations that threaten their self-respect, convey paternalistic sentiments, or question their dignity are not reasonably acceptable for reasons already explained. Moreover, as a practical matter, it might help the cause of social justice if alternative social bases of self-esteem were developed or made available without being coupled with a moralizing attack on ghetto cultural patterns. I don't even know what the fuck that means. How do you develop alternative social bases of self-esteem? I'm not going to get, even if their resistance to changing their cultural attachments is not entirely rational, many among the Black urban poor will naturally reject any suggestion that their cultural ways are having a corrosive effect on their life chances, for some have found meaning, solace, and self-worth in these cultural traits. In addition, as I have argued, the state lacks the moral standing to demand that the ghetto poor change their perspective or practices, at least until it establishes a more just social scheme. So it falls to concern private citizens and organizations to convince the politically alienated among the ghetto poor that active resistance to the current social arrangement is not pointless, that organizing, mobilizing, and putting pressure on government officials and private firms can yield positive results. It is often said that the oppressed should resist the injustices perpetrated against them. This duty to resist has at least two distinct normative grounds. There is, as discussed in Chapter 2, the duty of justice, which entails an obligation to try to end or lessen injustice, or, at minimum, to show enough moral concern to publicly condemn serious societal injustices. The duty of justice can enjoin us to openly resist social injustice when such acts would, for example, embolden the oppressed to fight back against those who would dominate and exploit them. Invite potential allies to join in the struggle for justice, or make those with the power and inclination to halt injustices aware that injustices are actually happening. Acts of resistance that are a response to the duty of justice are intended as contributions to effecting a more just society. An important thing to note here, though, is that the duty of justice does not require active resistance if it is reasonable to believe that such efforts would be ineffective or counterproductive in achieving justice. That's important. Thus, an appeal to the duty of justice is unlikely to move the politically alienated among the ghetto poor. In light of this, my suggestion is to make an appeal, perhaps indirectly, to the self-respect of the ghetto poor. Because political resistance to injustice expresses and potentially boosts self-respect, the Black urban poor have reasons of self-respect to, let me start that sentence over. Because political resistance to injustice expresses and potentially boosts self-respect, the Black urban poor have reasons of self-respect to participate in a movement for social change, even when they have reason to doubt the ultimate success of the collective effort. These are reasons the ghetto poor can reasonably accept. There you go. Reasons all can accept. There we go. More philosophical language. Anyway, and these reasons already move many, as is apparent in the resentment and rage they exhibit when confronted with the arbitrary and sometimes malicious exercise of police power. Because the injustices characteristic of ghettos are threats to the self-respect of the Black poor, that is, these injustices can potentially weaken their confidence in their equal moral worth, engaging in a collective struggle for social justice with others similarly committed can restore or fortify the self-respect of the ghetto poor. In addition, maintaining a robust sense of self-respect in the face of injustice can enhance self-esteem. We can increase our moral pride by successfully protecting ourselves against threats to our self-respect. We can do this not only through defiance of authority or transgressing mainstream norms, but also by protesting wrongs perpetrated against us, preventing others from violating our rights, or criticizing the beliefs and values that are used to justify our suffering and disadvantage. Efforts to change the basic structure of United States society should include the ghetto poor, not just as potential beneficiaries of such efforts, but as potential allies. There are already grassroots organizations and activists working to empower the ghetto poor and to increase their political participation. These efforts should be supported, joined, extended, and emulated. Not only could this dramatically increase the numbers of those pushing for social reform, but it might also help to sustain or create alternative sources of self-esteem for those attracted to suboptimal values, cultural values, and practices. Many could find self-worth in the form of moral pride and working together with others to bring about just social conditions or to thwart unjust actions and policies. But for this to occur, on an effective scale, forms of political solidarity that foster a commitment to the values of justice and mutual respect would need to be strengthened. Consequently, each member of these political associations could have their activities affirmed by other members, thereby buttressing individual and collective self-efficacy. Provided these alliances produced some concrete political victories and realistic hope for further gains, the result might well be the creation of more constructive social bases of self-esteem than those the ghetto poor sometimes embrace today. Those who want to act in solidarity with the ghetto poor can therefore legitimately encourage them to find self-esteem in the collective pursuit of corrective justice. So that's the end of the chapter. That's a lot to take in. I mean, it's a lot of philosophical verbiage. But really, I'm reading all of this because I want to get to this. Eventually, what I want to do is get to what he has to say about love and labor. Because this shit right here is the interesting part. This is the part everybody probably would love to tune into. But in order to do that, I feel like I had to at least go here. So there's a setup so you can understand the context in which he's making his arguments. Anybody got any questions right now? I would say go ahead, ask him. If you don't have any questions, I'm about to, zone out and get on with the rest of what I got to do. Any comments, anything? No comments, no questions, no nothing. I mean, eventually, like I said, we're going to get to, what he has to say about love and labor, and reproduction and all of that good stuff. Joe says no questions. Will IR says great lecture, no questions. So I guess, hey, it is what it is. I know everybody right now wants to talk about Pearly and all this kind of shit. I'm like, man, fuck all that. I ain't got time to be tripping off Pearly, bro. I'm trying to get back to the basics. But I want to have this conversation only insofar as, you got people talking about ghetto shit, but they talk about it in a way that I feel or consider to be just like severely non-linear. It's just like a lot of circular arguments, ad hoc arguments being made, but not really thought about in a sober-minded way. It's a lot of passion and feeling and, emotiveness related to it, but very rarely do you have like a long-winded, protracted, meticulous conversation about it. So. But the next time I come on, all I'm gonna do is wrap this shit up. I'm gonna outline what I've been doing thus far. So I'm gonna go over chapters 1, 2, and 3 when I come back. Maxo Excellence says, the not voting was interesting to me because I never thought I didn't vote because of distrust of the government. Why didn't you vote? Why did you think you didn't vote? I just don't vote. One could argue that most Americans don't vote. Not, consistently anyway. And then most people are disaffected by the system. But I've gone over this already. I've already had conversations with guys in the space about why it is that populism is not really actually promoted in the United States anyway. Yeah, like one could argue, you think that like democracy is like something that the founding fathers extolled. Not really. And most people, think that more democracy is better than having less, but you got many well-noted political theorists and statesmen who've argued against the whole idea that, democracy is a good thing. I mean, in fact, and I've said this before, you have many framers of the U.S. Constitution and people who signed the Declaration of Independence that were against direct democracy. They warned about the dangers related to it. Like if you look at James Madison, look at Federalist Paper number 10. And he says, like democracies are spectacles of turbulence and contention. They've never been compatible with personal security or the rights of property, and they've been short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Alexander Hamilton basically complained the ancient democracies in which the people themselves deliberated never had one good feature of government. Their character was tyranny. Their figure was deformity. John Witherspoon, who signed the Declaration of Independence, said, pure democracy can't subsist for long, nor be carried far into the departments of the state. It is subject to caprice and the madness of popular rage. Then you get to the 20th century, you got, sociologists like Joseph Schumpeter, who said that ordinary citizens in modern democracies, they're not intelligent enough to be charged with the responsibility of making complex political decisions. And he said, the average American citizen is uninterested in political life to begin with, and when he is interested, he's prone to exploitation and manipulation. So in the best case scenario, citizens are just going to give up the reins of government to technocrats, which limits the scope of citizens' political involvement to nothing more than electoral politics, which one could argue is not really actually, like what comes out of electoral politics, seriously? Let's just be frank about it. You even have a more recent repudiation of direct democracy. You got people called social choice theorists who say that the political process is really nothing more than an idealized expression of the economic process, where you have competition and rational choice assumptions, which are presupposed. So the ideal political process to social choice theorists is to see it as a competitive process where individual citizens, politicians, corporations, lobbyists, political action committees, unions, NGOs, and all that, each try to get what they want. They maximize their own utility and actualize their interests through game theory or some shit. They reject populism, especially as it pretends to be directed towards securing the public or the common good. So it's best for, citizens to behave like consumers, rather than it's like, thinking about the larger or the greater good. I'm just talking about, social choice theories. Go look it up. Go look up Joseph Schumpeter. Go look up John Witherspoon, Alexander Hamilton, all those guys. James Madison. Go look them up and see whether or not they were into democracy. They were not. I tend to think that, voting in and of itself, and we overestimate its power. I think that you need alternative means to be involved in political processes. That's just my viewpoint. But I'm with you, Leon. Well, no, I mean, Kaylon. I'm with you, Kaylon. I get it. But anyway, man, I'm off, man. I done sat here long enough. What I'll do is the next time I come, I'm gonna tie all of this shit together before I move on to the next subject. But the next subject is about family life. Actually, the name of the chapter is entitled Reproduction. I mean, if you look at the first paragraph of the chapter, he says this, and then I'm out. So this is foreshadowing. He says, a common view about the ghetto poor is they often remain in poverty and in disadvantaged black neighborhoods because they grow up in severely disadvantaged family environments and so have sharply diminished life prospects from the start. It is widely thought that such families are disadvantaged both because they are headed by young single mothers who lack the resources, maturity, or skills necessary to adequately care for their children, and because the fathers of these children fail to fulfill their parental responsibilities. In other words, many believe that a main factor in explaining the persistence of ghetto poverty is that some blacks create children when they lack the means, competence, or commitment to ensure the proper care and development of these children. Procreation under these conditions is commonly held to be not only unwise, but also wrong, plunging the already poor into deeper disadvantage, harming the offspring, and unfairly burdening fellow citizens. If more responsible procreating and parenting were to occur, so it is claimed, there would be a significant drop in poverty, and perhaps ghettos will finally disappear. Specifically, some believe that if more blacks would delay childbearing until they are older and financially secure, would get married or form stable co-parenting unions if they're going to have children, and faithfully carry out their parental duties, the cycle of poverty in the ghettos could be broken. This is how the ethics of procreating and parenting intersect with questions of social justice and ghetto poverty. So that's where he's going next. So let's get into it, man. But before I even go into that, I'm gonna recap the first, 3 chapters of the book. What up, BG? I see you in here, man. They don't want to talk to me, BGS, man. Maybe I curse them out too much. I don't know, man. But that's where I'm going next. Going into, that's where I'm going next. Maybe But anyway, man, this is where I really would like to have BGS's help. Not today, but when I start talking about the family and reproduction and stuff like that. That's that's why I want you guys' help, and I want your opinions. But to be perfectly honest, man, I think, you know, in many ways, man, dude, you know, he caved super fucking hard for single moms and shit like that, which, you know, not something that, you know, the original author of Dark Ghettos would do, but, you know, hey. But the arguments are there. I mean, he presents every argument that you could possibly imagine on what's wrong with single mother families. Everything is there. When I say everything is there, everything is there. He leaves no stone unturned. So anyway, man, I'm out of here, man. I'm about to go cook some shit, man. I'm hungry as hell. So I'll holler at y'all later, man. I'll holler at y'all on the next one. I'm out this joint.